This is Chapter 68 of Following the Equator. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Following the Equator by Mark Twain, Chapter 68. Judicious Mr. Rhodes. What South Africa consists of. Johannesburg. The gold mines. The heaven of American engineers. What the author knows about mining. Description of the Boer. What should be expected of him. What was. A dizzy jump for Rhodes. Taxes. Rhodesian method of reducing native population. Journeying in Cape Colony. The cars. The country. The weather. Tamed blacks. Familiar figures in King Williamstown. Boer dress. Boer country life. Sleeping accommodations. The reformers in Boer prison. Torturing a black prisoner. None of us can have as many virtues as the fountain pen, or half its cussedness, but we can try. Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar. The Duke of Fife has borne testimony that Mr. Rhodes deceived him. That is also what Mr. Rhodes did with the reformers. He got them into trouble, and then stayed out himself. A judicious man. He has always been that. As to this, there was a moment of doubt once. It was when he was out on his last pirating expedition in the Matabele country. The cable shouted out that he had gone unarmed to visit a party of hostile chiefs. It was true, too, and this daredevil thing came near fetching another indiscretion out of the poet laureate. It would have been too bad, for when the facts were all in, it turned out that there was a lady along, too, and she also was unarmed. In the opinion of many people, Mr. Rhodes is South Africa. Others think he is only a large part of it. These latter consider that South Africa consists of Table Mountain, the diamond mines, the Johannesburg gold fields, and Cecil Rhodes. The gold fields are wonderful in every way. In 7 or 8 years they built up, in a desert, a city of 100,000 inhabitants, counting white and black together. And not the ordinary mining city of wooden shanties, but a city made out of lasting material. Nowhere in the world is there such a concentration of rich mines as at Johannesburg. Mr. Bonamisi, my manager there, gave me a small gold brick with some statistics engraved upon it which record the output of gold from the early days to July, 1895, and exhibit the strides which have been made in the development of the industry. In 1888 the output was $4,162,440. The output of the next 5½ years was total $17,585,894. For the single year ending with June 1895, it was $45,553,700. The capital which has developed the mines came from England, the mining engineers from America. This is the case with the diamond mines also. South Africa seems to be the heaven of the American scientific mining engineer. He gets the choicest places and keeps them. His salary is not based upon what he would get in America, but apparently upon what a whole family of him would get there. The successful mines pay great dividends, yet the rock is not rich, from a Californian point of view. Rock which yields $10 or $12 a ton is considered plenty rich enough. It is troubled with base metals to such a degree that 20 years ago it would have been only about half as valuable as it is now, for at that time there was no paying way of getting anything out of such rock but the coarser-grained free gold. But the new cyanide process has changed all that, and the gold fields of the world now deliver up $50 million worth of gold per year, which would have gone into the tailing pile under the former conditions. The cyanide process was new to me, and full of interest, and among the costly and elaborate mining machinery there were fine things which were new to me, but I was already familiar with the rest of the details of the gold mining industry. I had been a gold miner myself in my day, and knew substantially everything that those people knew about it, except how to make money at it. But I learned a good deal about the Boers there, and that was a fresh subject. What I heard there was afterwards repeated to me in other parts of South Africa. Summed up, according to the information thus gained, this is the Boer. He is deeply religious, profoundly ignorant, dull, obstinate, bigoted, uncleanly in his habits, hospitable, honest in his dealings with the whites, a hard master to his black servant, lazy, a good shot, good horseman, addicted to the chase, a lover of political independence, a good husband and father, not fond of herding together in towns, but liking the seclusion and remoteness and solitude and empty vastness and silence of the veldt, a man of a mighty appetite, and not delicate about what he appeases it with, well satisfied with pork and Indian corn and biltong, requiring only that the quantity shall not be stinted, willing to ride a long journey to take a hand in a rude all-night dance, interspersed with vigorous feeding and boisterous jollity, but ready to ride twice as far for a prayer-meeting, proud of his Dutch and Huguenot origin and its religious and military history, proud of his race's achievements in South Africa, its bold plunges into hostile and uncharted deserts in search of free solitudes, unvexed by the pestering and detested English, also its victories over the natives and the British, proudest of all of the direct and effusive personal interest which the Deity has always taken in its affairs. He cannot read, he cannot write, he has one or two newspapers, but he is, apparently, not aware of it. Until latterly he had no schools, and taught his children nothing. News is a term which has no meaning to him, and the thing itself he cares nothing about. He hates to be taxed, and resents it. He has stood stock still in South Africa for 2 centuries and a half, and would like to stand still till the end of time, for he has no sympathy with Uitlander notions of progress. He is hungry to be rich, for he is human, but his preference has been for riches in cattle, not in fine clothes and fine houses and gold and diamonds. The gold and the diamonds have brought the godless stranger within his gates, also contamination and broken repose, and he wishes that they had never been discovered. I think that the bulk of those details can be found in Olive Schreiner's books, and she would not be accused of sketching the Boer's portrait with an unfair hand. Now, what would you expect from that unpromising material? What ought you to expect from it? Laws inimical to religious liberty? Yes. Laws denying representation and suffrage to the intruder? Yes. Laws unfriendly to educational institutions? Yes. Laws obstructive of gold production? Yes. Discouragement of railway expansion? Yes. Laws heavily taxing the intruder and overlooking the Boer? Yes. The Uitlander seems to have expected something very different from all that. I do not know why. Nothing different from it was rationally to be expected. A round man cannot be expected to fit a square hole right away. He must have time to modify his shape. The modification had begun in a detail or two before the raid, and was making some progress. It has made further progress since. There are wise men in the Boer government, and that accounts for the modification. The modification of the Boer mass has probably not begun yet. If the heads of the Boer government had not been wise men, they would have hanged Jameson, and thus turned a very commonplace pirate into a holy martyr. But even their wisdom has its limits, and they will hang Mr. Rhodes if they ever catch him. That will round him and complete him and make him a saint. He has already been called by all other titles that symbolize human grandeur, and he ought to rise to this one, the grandest of all. It will be a dizzy jump from where he is now, but that is nothing. It will land him in good company and be a pleasant change for him. Some of the things demanded by the Johannesburgers' manifesto have been conceded since the days of the raid, and the others will follow in time, no doubt. It was most fortunate for the miners of Johannesburg that the taxes which distressed them so much were levied by the Boer government, instead of by their friend Rhodes and his chartered company of highwaymen, for these latter take half of whatever their mining victims find. They do not stop at a mere percentage. If the Johannesburg miners were under their jurisdiction, they would be in the poorhouse in 12 months. I have been under the impression all along that I had an unpleasant paragraph about the Boers somewhere in my notebook, and also a pleasant one. I have found them now. The unpleasant one is dated at an interior village, and says, "Mr. Z. called. He is an English Afrikander, is an old resident, and has a Boer wife. He speaks the language, and his professional business is with the Boers exclusively. He told me that the ancient Boer families in the great region of which this village is the commercial center are falling victims to their inherited indolence and dullness in the materialistic latter-day race and struggle, and are dropping one by one into the grip of the usurer, getting hopelessly in debt, and are losing their high place and retiring to second and lower. The Boer's farm does not go to another Boer when he loses it, but to a foreigner. Some have fallen so low that they sell their daughters to the blacks." Under date of another South African town, I found the note which is creditable to the Boers. Dr. X told me that in the Kaffir War 1,500 Kaffirs took refuge in a great cave in the mountains about 90 miles north of Johannesburg, and the Boers blocked up the entrance and smoked them to death. Dr. X has been in there and seen the great array of bleached skeletons, one a woman with the skeleton of a child hugged to her breast. The great bulk of the savages must go. The white man wants their lands, and all must go excepting such percentage of them as he will need to do his work for him upon terms to be determined by himself. Since history has removed the element of guesswork from this matter and made it certainty, the humanest way of diminishing the black population should be adopted, not the old cruel ways of the past. Mr. Rhodes and his gang have been following the old ways. They are chartered to rob and slay, and they lawfully do it, but not in a compassionate and Christian spirit. They robbed the Mashonas and the Matabeles of a portion of their territories in the hallowed old style of purchase, for a song, and then they force a quarrel and take the rest by the strong hand. They robbed the natives of their cattle under the pretext that all the cattle in the country belong to the king whom they have tricked and assassinated. They issue regulations requiring the incensed and harassed natives to work for the white settlers and neglect their own affairs to do it. This is slavery, and is several times worse than was the American slavery which used to pain England so much. For when this Rhodesian slave is sick, superannuated, or otherwise disabled, he must support himself or starve. His master is under no obligation to support him. The reduction of the population by Rhodesian methods to the desired limit is a return to the old-time slow misery and lingering death system of a discredited time and a crude civilization. We humanely reduce an overplus of dogs by swift chloroform. The Boer humanely reduced an overplus of blacks by swift suffocation. The nameless but right-hearted Australian pioneer humanely reduced his overplus of aboriginal neighbors by a sweetened swift death concealed in a poisoned pudding. All these are admirable and worthy of praise. You and I would rather suffer either of these deaths 30 times over in 30 successive days than linger out one of the Rhodesian 20-year deaths, with its daily burden of insult, humiliation, and forced labor, for a man whose entire race the victim hates. Rhodesia is a happy name for that land of piracy and pillage, and puts the right stain upon it. Several long journeys gave us experience of the Cape Colony railways, easy riding fine cars, all the conveniences, thorough cleanliness, comfortable beds furnished for the night trains. It was in the first days of June and winter. The daytime was pleasant, the nighttime nice and cold. Spinning along all day in the cars, it was ecstasy to breathe the bracing air and gaze out over the vast brown solitudes of the velvet plains, soft and lovely near by, still softer and lovelier further away, softest and loveliest of all in the remote distances, where dim island hills seemed afloat, as in a sea made of dream stuff and flushed with colors faint and rich, and, dear me, the depth of the sky, and the beauty of the strange new cloud forms, and the glory of the sunshine, the lavishness, the wastefulness of it, the vigor and freshness and inspiration of the air and the sun, well, it was all just as Olive Schreiner had made it in her books. To me the veldt, in its sober winter garb, was surpassingly beautiful. There were unlevel stretches where it was rolling and swelling, and rising and subsiding, and sweeping superbly on, and still on and on like an ocean, toward the far-away horizon, its pale brown deepening by delicately graduated shades to rich orange, and finally to purple and crimson where it washed against the wooded hills and naked red crags at the base of the sky. Everywhere, from Cape Town to Kimberley, and from Kimberley to Port Elizabeth and East London, the towns were well populated with tamed blacks. Tamed and Christianized, too, I suppose, for they wore the dowdy clothes of our Christian civilization. But for that, many of them would have been remarkably handsome. These fiendish clothes, together with the proper lounging gait, good-natured face, happy air, and easy laugh, made them precise counterparts of our American blacks. Often, where all the other aspects were strikingly and harmoniously and thrillingly African, a flock of these natives would intrude, looking wholly out of place, and spoil it all, making the thing a grating discord, half African and half American. One Sunday in King Williamstown a score of colored women came mincing across the great barren square, dressed, in the last perfection of fashion and newness and expensiveness and showy mixture of unrelated colors, all just as I had seen it so often at home, and in their faces and their gait was that languishing, aristocratic, divine delight in their finery which was so familiar to me, and had always been such a satisfaction to my eye and my heart. I seemed among old friends, friends of 50 years, and I stopped and cordially greeted them. They broke into a good-fellowship laugh, flashing their white teeth upon me, and all answered at once. I did not understand a word they said. I was astonished. I was not dreaming that they would answer in anything but American. The voices, too, of the African women were familiar to me, sweet and musical, just like those of the slave women of my early days. I followed a couple of them all over the Orange-Free State, over its capital, Bloemfontein, to hear their liquid voices and the happy ripple of their laughter. Their language was a large improvement upon American, also upon the Zulu. It had no Zulu clicks in it, and it seemed to have no angles or corners, no roughness, no vile s's or other hissing sounds, but was very, very mellow and rounded and flowing. In moving about the country in the trains, I had opportunity to see a good many Boers of the veldt. One day, at a village station, 100 of them got out of the third-class cars to feed. Their clothes were very interesting. For ugliness of shapes and for miracles of ugly colors inharmoniously associated, they were a record. The effect was nearly as exciting and interesting as that produced by the brilliant and beautiful clothes and perfect taste always on view at the Indian railway stations. One man had corduroy trousers of a faded chewing-gum tint, and they were new, showing that this tint did not come by calamity, but was intentional, the very ugliest color I have ever seen. A gaunt, shackly country lout 6 feet high, in battered gray slouched hat with wide brim, and old resin-colored breeches, had on a hideous brand-new woolen coat which was imitation tiger-skin, wavy broad stripes of dazzling yellow and deep brown. I thought he ought to be hanged, and asked the station-master if it could be arranged. He said no, and not only that, but said it rudely, said it with a quite unnecessary show of feeling. Then he muttered something about my being a jackass, and walked away and pointed me out to people, and did everything he could to turn public sentiment against me. It is what one gets for trying to do good. In the train that day a passenger told me some more about Boer life out in the lonely veldt. He said the Boer gets up early and sets his "niggers" at their tasks, pasturing the cattle and watching them; eats, smokes, drowses, sleeps. Toward evening superintends the milking, etc. Eats, smokes, drowses, goes to bed at early candlelight in the fragrant clothes he and she have worn all day and every week-day for years. I remember that last detail in Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm. And the passenger told me that the Boers were justly noted for their hospitality. He told me a story about it. He said that his Grace the Bishop of a certain see was once making a business progress through the tavernless veldt, and one night he stopped with a boar. After supper was shown to bed. He undressed, weary and worn out, and was soon sound asleep. In the night he woke up feeling crowded and suffocated, and found the old boar and his fat wife in bed with him, one on each side, with all their clothes on, and snoring. He had to stay there and stand it, awake and suffering, until toward dawn, when sleep again fell upon him for an hour. Then he woke again. The boar was gone, but the wife was still at his side. Those reformers detested that Boer prison. They were not used to cramped quarters and tedious hours, and weary idleness, and early to bed, and limited movement, and arbitrary and irritating rules, and the absence of the luxuries which wealth comforts the day and the night with. The confinement told upon their bodies and their spirits. Still, they were superior men, and they made the best that was to be made of the circumstances. Their wives smuggled delicacies to them, which helped to smooth the way down for the prison fare. In the train Mr. B. told me that the Boer jail guards treated the black prisoners, even political ones, mercilessly. An African chief and his following had been kept there 9 months without trial, and during all that time they had been without shelter from rain and sun. He said that one day the guards put a big black in the stocks for dashing his soup on the ground. They stretched his legs painfully wide apart, and set him with his back downhill. He could not endure it, and put back his hands upon the slope for support. The guard ordered him to withdraw the support, and kicked him in the back. Then, said Mr. B., the powerful black wrenched the stocks asunder and went for the guard. A reform prisoner pulled him off, and thrashed the guard himself. End of chapter 68.